What's up, friends? Welcome back to Three Tales. I'm Opie, and I'll be showing you guys the detailed run-through on how I built the bookshelves for the library. Now, these were kind of heavy, and I ended up having to batch out a whole lot of these. So stay tuned, and I'll give you guys the detailed run-through on how I built all of these. For this build, I'm still going to be using 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood. I need all of my sides ripped down to 12 inches wide, so I set up my table saw and I just started making passes. Setting it up this way made it so that I could just take all of the plywood, cut it all down, and all of it would be the exact same size. After I was done ripping all the boards down, I added in a rabbet to one side of it. This is going to be able to accept the 1/4 inch beadboard that I made for this project. If you'd like to see how I made that beadboard, you can feel free to click up at the annotation at the top now. I used a regular curved blade on this part. I didn't choose to use the dado stack. It's 3/8 of an inch. I could have done it either way, but I didn't really feel like changing the blade. Now, another route that you can go at adding these rabbets on the sides is doing it with a router. I used a speed square, combination square to just kind of guide out the lines, and then I used a router. You can use either a fence for your router, or I actually ended up making this jig that I used to do the insets for bookcases, so I just use that for my router now instead. It works out pretty well, in fact. This is the jig that I ended up building to make sure that my insets for the bookshelves was perfect every time. I didn't really want to spend a lot of time trying to sneak up on the cut to make sure that it was nice and snug, and this did it every time perfect. I used a box cutter to cut through all the fibers to make sure there wasn't any blowout when I was using the router, and then after that I used my speed square to set the proper depth for the router. I needed it to be a little bit deeper than 1/8 of an inch. And actually, when I was setting this up, I forgot to add on the 1/8 of an inch that I used jig. So I went back and fixed that later. When I'm doing this with the router, since I have it on the jig, it's honestly pretty easy going, but I just want to make sure that I'm not trying to hog out too much material at once. These bits are really strong, but it can easily burn or run away, and there's no reason to take the chance on that. Also, make sure that you're wearing a mask and eye protection, because there's nothing worse than wood chip boogers. Now, we're going to be making some really hardy bookshelves for this bookcase, so I needed the table saw to be at the 45-degree angle. Pick up a digital readout if you don't have one. They're $15 on Amazon. They're amazing. I cut down the plywood to 45 degrees, and I did two separate pieces, the top and the bottom, both cut at 45 degrees, opposite of each other. And then I did this cool little trick where you take the table saw and you cut off 3/4 of an inch for the depth of the plywood, and then an extra 1/8 of an inch for the thickness of the blade curve. After you do that, you flip it over and do another cut, and it comes out with a perfect triangle left. And we use that to do the front facing, and that makes the entire board look like one solid piece of hardwood. It's a cool trick, and it will make these the strongest shelves you have ever seen in your life. To put all these shelves together, it was pretty simple. Just a lot of wood glue. I use Ultimate number 3. It's the best around. It's waterproof. It's a little bit more expensive, but it's a very good product. And then I use a little bit of sawdust in between the coatings, and that's just to help it so that it doesn't slide around. Some people use salt, and it's funny because I'm a chef and I would not waste salt. Why would you waste salt like that? But I just did this and then made sure it was perfectly in line. This is the only part that if it's not in line, you can't cut or fix or go back. It's just gonna make everything look super wonky. So take your time on that part, but otherwise, just clamp and go. Make sure it's good to go. I stacked them all up at once, did a whole big clamp on it, and just put a bunch of weight on top. With a liberal amount of glue, we can put our triangle back inside of this V shape for our shelves. This is going to finish adding the strength, and it's also going to give it a waterfall look and make it look kind of like one solid piece of hardwood. To keep it in place, I'm just going to be using 3 to 4 brad nails. I don't want to use a lot to have a whole bunch of little holes that I have to fill with wood filler. And I like to make my own wood filler. I always use maple sawdust, usually as fine as I can find it, and then I'll stain it with whatever stain I'm going to be finishing with. Wood glue doesn't always take stain very well, and so it's best if you can just stain it all at this point and mix in your wood glue. I'm using Type Bond 3, but you can just use any kind of wood glue you want, and you want to mix it up until it's kind of like a wet Play-Doh, I guess you could say, a little sandy, and that's usually good enough. Most of the shelves came out pretty good. I did have to batch out 16, so there were a couple of voids and mishaps, and just filling up the brad holes too. I just used the wood filler, made sure that I got it all the way into the cracks and crevices, and then I came through and rubbed off any of the excess. We go through and sand this afterwards, and being a plywood veneer, if you sand too much and have too much friction on there, it will go through the veneer and it will look awful. After that was done, we cut down all of the bookshelves on the cross sled and ripped them all down to their final dimension to make them uniform on the table saw. Now it was just time for stain and then assembly. We stain the pieces off screen. You want to do this before you do assembly, obviously, it just makes it way easier. This is an ebony and a English chestnut, if you're curious. So we're putting in glue in all of our rabbets and insets, but we are not putting it in the back rabbet, which is going to be housing the beadboard. And then those insets that we routed out make it very easy to get these lined up. Just go ahead and make sure that they slide into the little pockets that you made. And then when that's done, you want to go ahead and put in just a couple brad nails. Same thing, you just need enough to hold it into place while you keep working, but you don't want to have too many holes that you have to fill afterwards. Then obviously just the same thing on the left hand side, rinse and repeat. And take the measurements for the dimensions of the beadboard. I also did about a 1/2 inch extra overhang, and that's because it's going to be sliding behind my countertop. I used this little 1/8 inch jig to give me kind of like track saw. Cost me like $5 to make it. It's amazing. I highly recommend it. There's some great YouTube videos out there. Now, here's a good trick for you whenever you're adding on your backer board to any kind of bookshelf. Go ahead and staple in the top of it only, and then check your measurements. You want to make sure that from corner to corner you have identical measurements, and if not, if it's off in any way, this is a good chance to kind of shift it in whichever direction you want. Here I was off probably a 32nd to a 16th of an inch off, and then just with a little bit of oomph, I was able to get it back into the correct position, and then you can go ahead and continue stapling the rest of it down. So to do the spraying, what I'm going to be doing is using the Sherwin-Williams Fast Dry Sealer. It does seal ridiculously fast. It's kind of one of those things where you walk into a super commercialized building and they only sell it in like 5 gallons, so it's also extremely expensive. It's probably about $70 a gallon. And then I'll be finishing it with the same version in the lacquer, and I'll be thinning it out with some lacquer thinner. It does cost a lot of money, but it cures in about 15 minutes, and you can just kind of keep going. It's also extremely noxious, so make sure that you wear your proper respirator and everything. But without that, just kind of go. It's going to be fast, and I love that. So, especially when you're spraying a whole bunch of large stuff, you want to do it quickly. So, it's a good investment. To do this spraying, I'm going to be using an Erlex spray station. It's about $300 on Amazon. It's an amazing unit if you need to do any DIY spray. I highly recommend it. It's self-contained, so you don't need an extra air compressor or anything like that. Just turn it on and go. In between coats, I'm using a 300 grit sanding block to knock down any bubbles or high spots or anything and smooth out the lacquer, and then using a tack cloth as well to get any of the dust off, and then just continue putting on more layers of lacquer. I did about 3 for each bookcase. Took about 45 minutes to an hour. Again, a worthwhile investment if you're doing some serious work. So with that, you've pretty much been able to complete your bookcase. There's a couple small options that you have to finish capping off these sides so that you don't have that plywood exposed on the edge. You can either get some half round and you can cover the end of it with that. You can take a piece of maple or oak and then cut off strips, just making sure that they're at least 3/4 of an inch thick, and then stain and cap them like that. I actually ended up going ahead and made these fluted pillars. I made them all out of maple. If you'd like to see how I did that, you can feel free to click the annotation here at the top, and I have a small detailed video. It's pretty short, but it goes through the entire process of how I made these fluted pillars. So you may like that. With that, your bookcase is done. So I hope that you really enjoyed this. I hope it was educational for you, or you just had a good time watching somebody build something, I guess. I don't know. If you want to see any other parts of this build, then feel free. I'll have the links to all the other builds that made this library possible in the description. And if not, then you can click on this video over here, or maybe even this one over here. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow along, and I'll see you guys on the next video. Thanks a lot, friends.